At 0247 local time, this Russian patrol boat tracked something impossible on its radar: Ukrainian drones heading straight for Crimea's most protected airspace. What happened next would expose a fatal flaw in Russia's entire defense system. Suddenly, the drone operator's screen exploded with light. 5 missiles streaked through the darkness, 30 million rubles of precision weaponry fired in desperation. But these weren't the targets Russia had trained for. As the smoke cleared, Russians saw something that shouldn't exist. The drone was still flying, completely untouched. Now inside Crimean airspace, these FPV drones had one goal in mind: take out the Russian defenses surrounding Mount Airy. But first, they had to survive something no one thought possible. On the beach below, a Russian Panzer S-1 air defense system swiveled its radar dish frantically. This wasn't some leftover Soviet junk. This was their premier point defense weapon designed to destroy cruise missiles and protect important Russian sites. It had just burned through 30 million rubles worth of missiles without hitting a drone that cost less than an iPhone. As the drones continued, Mount Airy filled the thermal display, those distinctive domes crowning its summit like giant golf balls. The Panzer fired again, this time switching to its 30mm cannons. Tracers painted light patterns across the darkness, beautiful and completely useless. The rounds weren't even close. The Russian operator had a problem he didn't understand. The Ukrainian drone was flying perpendicular to the radar beam at exactly 50 m altitude, which created something called a Doppler notch. This is because radars don't just see objects, they measure how fast something is moving toward or away from them. That speed is called radial velocity. If a drone flies sideways across the radar beam instead of toward or away from the radar, its radial velocity drops close to zero. To the radar's computer, a target with zero radial velocity looks like stationary ground clutter. So the system filters it out to avoid tracking these false targets. Even worse, radar waves bouncing off the sea created ghost images below each drone. The tracking computer tried to average the real target with its reflection, sending missiles to empty air between them. Those proximity fuses needed something car door-sized to trigger, half a square meter of radar return. These drones gave back 1/100th of that. The missiles literally didn't recognize them as valid targets. As the Panzer operator was figuring out why his system was now an expensive paperweight, more drones appeared in the thermal feed, converging from different vectors like a swarm of mechanical wasps. The Panzer had detected them at 2 kilometers, but its missiles needed 1.5 kilometers just to arm their warheads at 40 meters per second closure rate. That meant 12 seconds from first detection to watching them fly past, 12 seconds to engage targets his system wasn't designed to see. Radio chatter exploded across Russian frequencies, controllers demanding fighter support, the Panzer operator reporting multiple contacts unable to engage, someone yelling about missiles that wouldn't track. These weren't the Tomahawks they trained for. These were toys moving at highway speeds. And somehow, that made them invisible. At 0250 hours, the lead drone adjusted course slightly, lining up on the first dome structure. Inside those protective shells sat radars worth hundreds of millions, equipment that could track ballistic missiles in space, supposedly detect stealth fighters, and provide early warning for the entire Black Sea region. The domes themselves cost millions to build, designed to survive 1,000-pound bombs dropped from 30,000 feet. Nobody had considered what would happen when the attack came from consumer electronics flying at treetop height. Behind the lead drone, others approached their assigned targets. The Panzer operator could only watch his screen and report his failure. His commander's response was immediate and desperate: scramble fighters now. Just as the Panzer was giving up, an Su-30 fighter dove through the pre-dawn darkness. This was Russia's answer to the F-15, fresh from the production line, equipped with thrust vectoring and a radar that could supposedly track golf balls from space. But it would soon show it couldn't see something right in front of it. The pilot's BARS radar, the aircraft's primary radar for tracking targets and weapons guidance, showed something that made no sense. Contacts appeared and vanished like fireflies, there for one sweep, then gone for the next. The system needed 5 consecutive radar returns to confirm a target was real, but these drones kept dropping below the noise floor after 2 or 3. The noise floor is the baseline level of background radio noise a radar or receiver naturally picks up. When a drone signal drops below that level, it effectively becomes invisible because the radar can't distinguish it from background static. This caused the computer to keep starting over, never getting enough data to establish what pilots called a track file. Frustrated that his radar couldn't maintain lock, the pilot let a missile rip anyway. The UP-73 dropped from the wing, a motor igniting, accelerating to Mach 2.5 in seconds, 20 million rubles of precision engineering designed to chase jet fighters through any maneuver. The drone's thermal camera caught everything, the missile racing toward the drone, seeker head scanning, getting closer and closer, then veering off like it had remembered something more important elsewhere. The problem was temperature. The UP-73 hunted for jet engines burning at 1,000 degrees. Heat signatures it could lock onto from 30 kilometers away. These electric drone motors ran at maybe 50 degrees Celsius, barely warmer than a laptop computer. The infrared seeker couldn't see them until it got within 500 m. And by then, it was moving too fast to correct course. Before the drones could react, the pilot fired a second missile, passing so close the blast shook the drone's camera. Still no hit. Even pulling 40 gs at Mach 2.5, the missile's turning radius was still 600 m. When you're engaging at 2 kilometers, and the target randomly jinks every couple of seconds, there's simply not enough room to maneuver. Physics just doesn't care how advanced your weapons are. Now growing increasingly desperate, the pilot let loose a third missile, then a fourth. The pilot had just burned through 80 million rubles of ordnance with nothing to show for it. But he did have one more thing he could try. The weapon you see here is called a Gsha-30. And at 0252 hours, he opened up, spraying 30mm rounds at 1,500 per minute. But none of the shots were connecting. This is because the fire control computer calculated perfect lead angles based on linear prediction, assuming the target would keep flying straight. Every 2 seconds, these drones shifted randomly left or right, just 2 to 3 meters, barely noticeable. But by the time those rounds traveled a kilometer, that small shift had become a 10 m miss. The computer was solving the previous second's problem while the drones created new ones. Meanwhile, 500 m below, the first drone reached its target. The 96L6E radar, NATO designation cheeseboard, sat exposed on its vehicle mount. This wasn't just any radar. It provided targeting data for S-400 systems, could track 100 targets simultaneously, and coordinate multiple missile engagements. Without it, these famous S-400s everyone feared wouldn't see past their own sensors. At 0254 hours, the drone-shaped charge detonated against the antenna array. Molten copper moving at 8 km per second punched through delicate electronics, creating electrical paths between circuits that never should connect. Millions of dollars of sophisticated electronics turned to smoking scrap in the time it takes to blink. Now out of missiles, the Su-30 pulled up hard. The pilot reported his failure to ground control. His fuel gauge showed he needed to return to base immediately. For missiles fired, hundreds of cannon rounds expended, 0 hits. As he climbed away, more drones continued unopposed toward Mount Airy. But the pilot's radar showed something that made no sense. These new contacts weren't coming from Ukrainian territory. They were appearing from nowhere, materializing 10 kilometers off the coast like ghosts rising from the sea itself. Ground control had the same impossible reading. While the Russians were focused on what was already airborne, they failed to realize what was right under their nose. 10 kilometers off Crimea's coast, FPV drones sat on launch rails, their operators nowhere near this floating platform. The boats, with no official name yet but belonging to the Ursula family, had been sitting here for 2 hours, completely invisible to every radar on the mountain ahead. The secret was geometry, not technology. The Podlet K1 radar on Mount Itri could detect aircraft at 300 kilometers and track ballistic missiles in space, impressive capabilities unless you understood basic trigonometry. Sitting at roughly 3,600 foot elevation with a minimum depression angle of -2 degrees, the radar physically couldn't see anything below 43 m altitude within 10 kilometers of shore. These boats cruised at 5 m above the waves. They weren't evading detection, they were sailing through a blind zone the size of a small city that physics had carved into the coverage. Seeing the first drones knocking out the S-400 radar, the USV began launching more drones, their electric motors spinning up with a sound like angry hornets. But how these FPV drones were able to do this dozens of kilometers from shore was because of this system. You see, Ukraine doesn't fly drones directly from Odessa to Crimea with a single radio signal. That would be impossible because the Earth's curve and distance would block the connection after just a few miles. Instead, they use relay boats like this one sitting 10 to 20 kilometers off the Crimean coast. These boats act like floating cell towers with tall antennas and high-powered radios or Starlink links. The drone operator in Odessa sends commands through an encrypted internet link to the boat. The boat then transmits those commands to the drones nearby. The drone's video feed takes the same path in reverse, bouncing from the drone to the boat and then back to Odessa almost instantly. This setup means Ukraine doesn't need dozens of boats to cover the entire 200-plus kilometer distance, just 3 to 5 relay boats positioned offshore can handle the mission. They stay close enough to the drones to maintain a clean, low-latency connection, while secure long-range data links handle the distance between the operator and the boats. This system lets operators stay safe far from the front line while still flying drones with precision deep inside Russian-controlled airspace. This means they were flying combat missions while drinking coffee, controlling everything through what was essentially a floating Wi-Fi extender. Even if Russia figured out where the signals originated, they could never hit them. At 0257 hours, more boats became visible as dawn approached, each launching its own swarm. The drones didn't form military attack patterns that might trigger alerts. Instead, they scattered like startled birds, each taking a seemingly random path that would somehow converge on Aptry at exactly the same moment. Funny how nature works sometimes. The coastal radars that should have spotted these boats had been programmed to ignore them. Signal processors filtered out anything moving under 20 knots as civilian traffic, fishing boats, cargo vessels, not worth the attention of military systems. These USVs deliberately cruised at 15 knots or less, looking exactly like every other non-threat cluttering up the scope. To the computers watching Crimea's shores, they were invisible by choice. Within 2 minutes of this new launch, the lead drone of the second swarm approached the first dome's base. No windows, no doors, just smooth concrete and fiberglass engineered to survive aerial bombardment. But the Ukrainians had found what the designers overlooked: emergency access panels at ground level where maintenance crews could enter. These panels could withstand 500 psi of overpressure from bombs exploding overhead, impressive engineering, but nobody had considered direct contact with shaped charges. A focused jet of molten copper delivered 2 million psi at the point of impact. The reinforced steel panels might as well have been made of paper. The Nebo dome took the next hit. This radar was Russia's crown jewel, the answer to stealth technology. Using meter-wave frequencies that could supposedly detect F-35s at 600 kilometers. Without it, every S-400 battery in Crimea would be blind beyond 40 kilometers. Their own radars are unable to see past the horizon without this crucial data feed. By 0259 hours, the boats had launched all of their drones. With the Russians now blind for good, it was time to bring the hammer down. At 0302 hours, the Russians' whole world exploded on the mountaintop. The Nebo's massive VHF array, now exposed with its dome punctured, took direct hits to crucial junctions. The shaped charges didn't just make holes, they created plasma channels that turned insulators into superconductors. When the copper jet punched through, resistance dropped to near zero. Suddenly, those 2-amp circuits carried 1000 amps, and the surge raced through waveguides to adjacent modules faster than electricity through water. 40 seconds later, the Podlet K1 took multiple hits to its transmitter sections. This radar watched Crimea's low-altitude approaches, could track cruise missiles hugging the terrain at 300 kilometers. Without it, anything below 100 m altitude became invisible to the entire defense network. Years of coverage vanished in seconds. 3 kilometers away, the BK-16 landing craft appeared in the thermal feed. The crew had spotted approaching drones and opened fire with everything available: 14.5mm deck guns, small arms. The boat's navigation radar showed dots approaching on the screen, but navigation radars don't calculate firing solutions. They were shooting at shadows and hope. The drone assigned to the BK-16 ignored the defensive fire completely. These weren't smart weapons that could be jammed or spoofed. They were dumb and determined, following GPS waypoints to impact with mechanical certainty. The thermal feed cut just as it impacted its bow. Back on the mountain, the cascade accelerated. The S-400 batteries that protected Crimea, those weapons everyone feared could reach out 400 kilometers and swat any aircraft from the sky, had just become very expensive lawn ornaments. They needed the Nebo's 600 kilometers early warning to see beyond their own 40 to 50 kilometers radar horizon. They needed the Podlet's low-altitude tracking to detect anything below 100 m. They needed the still-burning 96L6E to coordinate handoffs between systems. Without those radars, their operators could only sit and watch what happened next. The Itri command post took the final hit. This bunker didn't just house computers, it was the brain that made Western Crimea's air defense function as a network. Every track, every identification, every engagement order ran through servers that were about to become very expensive smoke generators. The shaped charge turned the reinforced door into modern art. Fire erupted from the entrance as everything inside, computers, cables, classified documents, began burning. Secondary explosions indicated something volatile cooking off, probably ammunition or fuel reserves. Whatever command capability had existed here was gone forever. Without these assets, the entire chain shattered. Acquisition radars couldn't find targets to pass to fire control radars. Fire control radars couldn't receive tracking data to assign to launchers. Launchers couldn't get the information needed to guide missiles to intercept. Every link had been severed simultaneously, and there were no backups within 100 kilometers. Bye for now.